back, regulars, and welcome into the 90%. In terms of Star Rail, I am a somewhat casual player, and I am not very well versed in the lore. I do not normally listen through entire quests because they just don't hold my attention. Penacony's quest was an exception to a certain degree, and overall I found this one a hell of a lot more engaging than some of the other quests that we've had. Of course, there is a lot of unnecessary yapping. I think the music and the other atmospheric elements of Penacony in general just made this a lot more tolerable, but I liked it enough to make a video, so let's talk about the Penacony quest. I think the intro to this quest was done very well. They threw you into the deep end right off the bat. I personally like when stories do this because while it is a huge info dump, it doesn't feel that way, and it sets up things for us without having to sit through very obvious fourth wall breaking info dumps. And I think Acheron's existence, as strange and mysterious as it is, was a great way to introduce us to Penacony. I felt like it gave me something to look forward to and an incentive to actually sit through dialogue. It was also a good choice that they actually showed us the effects of Memoria instead of just telling us what it was in concept. I think without this part, the whole departure and arrival at the Reverie before getting into the Dreamscape would have dragged, and it was a good break from that mundanity. If you can't engage your audience by normal means, why not show them something weird enough to make them stay? And Acheron is cool, weird, and makes no sense, so I guess this was a good move. Also, I am a simp for fractured narrative structures in stories, and Acheron's character made me think this could be a possibility. Even through the part at the Reverie, I had the will to sit through that initial info dump because it felt like a chance to start getting answers. There was a lot of filler that I felt like was supposed to make it feel realistic, which I think is better left out, but such is life when you play Hoyoverse games. But learning about the suspicious aspects of the invitation to Penacony was able to bring my attention back in full. At least for a little. One thing that stood out, which I don't remember other quests doing, was explicating on all the conflicts of interest that were going to be at play in the story. Even though the whole not having the rooms in order thing was kind of a boring way to show this, I'm glad that it set this up. There was a general mistrust which defined a lot of the relationships in the story, and this helped it feel a lot less shallow than other stories. And of course, there's nothing wrong with the story being shallow, but this made it seem more refined, hence making it feel worth the time to actually sit and play through. Also, I think we all know sometimes there's a bit too much shallow in these quests, so it was a nice change of pace. Also, they actually made Aventurine a pretty interesting character. Almost as interesting as Acheron, I felt at the time. So after this, I actually had hope for the Penacony arc. The initial splitting up thing felt kinda weird because it didn't seem to serve a significant function to the characters, but that didn't feel like a huge break from reality. This was the first significant point where I felt like the direction of the story was starting to get a little lost. But my biggest issues didn't start until Firefly was introduced. She did not feel well integrated into the story. It didn't feel like there was a reason for Trailblazer to just get into a fight, let alone become besties with Firefly over the course of like an hour. The whole tour thing felt forced, and it felt like the most shameless info dump I have seen since the last Star Rail quest I sat through. After the second act, I do understand why this part was important, but I think there are better ways this could have been executed. I think if one of the other Express members had gone with the Trailblazer, at least there could have been a sentence of dialogue of deliberation about why they choose to save her. Of course, this is Hoyoverse, so we're not going to get just a few bits of dialogue. We'll get an entire dissertation before they finally decide that yes, they will in fact save Firefly, but there's gotta be other options. I know Hoyo wants to introduce more characters because money, but this role felt like it should have been filled by a character we already knew. It would have made the story feel more natural. It felt like wandering around aimlessly only to sell a half-baked character, and it's very hard to incite empathy when the story breaks from reality to this extent. Even with her backstory, it just felt very unnatural. The only emotion I felt was annoyance at the squandering of a solid first act, and it did not help that every other character felt the need to point out how close she and the Trailblazer were because the story itself wasn't able to do it on its own. Of course, no shame if you enjoyed Firefly's part. I just felt like this is where the story took a bad turn. I know I said before that I do enjoy when a story leaves you with questions, but the one question a story shouldn't leave you with is why it feels like what the characters are doing is pointless. A character needs to have a purpose or a reason for doing the things they do, otherwise an audience cannot be expected to care. By the time we met Black Swan, I was just upset by having had sat through the entirety of the Firefly part, so the real Dreamscape part wasn't all that interesting, but at least the Trailblazer had a goal for the first time in hours. However, I was no longer immersed in the story. And just investigating is such a weak goal, but at least it's something. And yes, I'm sorry, I did not care when Firefly died. So then we're informed that Robin is dead, or dream dead, or simply gotten by the death, which felt slightly more meaningful than Firefly's, but that's because it felt like it had a place in the grand scheme of things more. Of course, after this, in typical Hoyoverse fashion, we were then again thrown into a scene, forced to watch a lengthy deliberation between the Astral Express members. I don't know who needs to hear this, but sometimes you can trust your audience to pick things up themselves, and if you develop your characters enough, we don't have to hear their reasoning through every bit of material info. But my attention was still held, because it was Acheron banner season, which means that certainly we'll be getting more information about her, right? And in some ways, we did get a lot of information, and in other ways, I still don't understand her existence. And still, by this promise of answers, I was carried into one of the best parts of this quest. Firstly, I must say, I found the point of view switching a very good choice. It made the story feel more complete without having to rely on dialogue to relay information between characters. A lot of times side characters are underdeveloped because we don't get to see their perspectives or what they do when the main character isn't with them, or when they are around the main character, they lack meaningful interactions because of conflicts of interest. The Aventurine point of view was done well. And yes, I know I acknowledged before I like fractured narrative structures a little too much, but the intercuts in time made it flow so naturally and actually kept it engaging. The parts with Dr. Ratio were very amusing. I love when Hoyo actually decides to make characters that are not likable as people. It makes them interesting. Of course, that is not sufficient to make a character interesting. They also have to have actual goals, but this is still a very hard prerequisite to come by when analyzing Hoyoverse characters. Also, 3 words, 17 system hours. They actually made a great move in terms of raising the stakes. Time constraints are like the ultimate storytelling hack for making things feel more intense, so I don't know why they don't do this more, but boy did it feel good. I like that we actually got to see Aventurine's methods and planning play out itself, because if we had heard about it through dialogue, it would have felt very cheap. Problem with this whole part was that it made the Trailblazer POV very boring in comparison. That is until the Aventurine battle. I got to do a Gambler v Gambler showdown, and this boss fight was so extra, so goofy, and incredibly hype. Also, this is a good time to mention that I am someone who plays this game for the gambling and the combat, so I may be a little biased about this. I realize this dude is like really important to the quest, but he bored me. I do not appreciate being forced to prepare drinks. I think the Penacony lore could have been presented better. It's not all that fun to sit around and listen to a new random character give a history lesson. Just anything a bit more interactive would have been nicer. I realize the information we got from him is important, but he managed to deliver it in the most boring way possible. This was an instance in which the multiple POVs felt very poorly done. There was a lot of reiteration of previously established information before we could actually get anything new, and this could have been significantly shorter. As I record this, I realize that it sounds like there is a lot of things I did not enjoy about this quest, which is true, but I also found it good. A lot of my issues were with the world building feeling too metaphysically flimsy, and I was left wishing that I had sat through all the bad parts during my playthrough. Also, I would be remiss not to acknowledge the fact that Star Rail desperately needs to learn how to balance their audio. I didn't really understand the deal with Sparkle, but I feel like this is going to become more clear in the future, and those scenes were set up in such a way that it did not feel excessively unnatural. Overall, I liked it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you made it this far, I would hope that you did. I make content reviewing stories and character type stuff in this game. I also stream, post some of those highlights occasionally, and I do a lot of Genshin content. So if you enjoy that, head over to my Twitch, consider liking the video if you're feeling generous or just want to save it for later, subscribe if you're interested in the channel as a whole, and whatever you go on to do, do it well.